am Elena, 34 years old, and I never thought a Christmas gift that seemed so harmless would become the key to unlocking the horrifying secret behind my son's disappearance. I still remember clearly the moment the small gift box was opened. The uneasiness and avoidance from my family felt like the answer my husband and I had been searching for over the past 5 months. "It wasn't just a toy," I murmured, my trembling hands clutching it tightly. It was proof my son had been here and vanished in the hands of his own family. Before I tell you what really happened on that Christmas night, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. And hit like if you've ever had a moment when one tiny detail shattered your entire world. Daniel and I stood before the red-painted wooden door of my parents' house. The cold air from outside stung my face, while from inside came the familiar sound of Christmas music and the chatter of voices. Yet when I held my husband's hand to step in, what filled me wasn't the anticipation of reunion, but a suffocating tightness. As if even the air in this house rejected our presence. The door swung open. A golden glow spilled from the living room, the Christmas tree towering to the ceiling, dazzling with red ornaments and shimmering tinsel. But beneath that light, I saw the strained smiles on everyone's faces. My mother stepped forward and gave me a half-hearted hug, one where bodies touched but hearts didn't. My father only nodded, his eyes skimming over me as if checking off my attendance, then instantly turned to Grace, my younger sister, to compliment the sparkling red dress she was wearing. Daniel squeezed my hand. He forced a polite smile, but I knew behind it was tension. We had carried with us a hollow emptiness for the past 5 months since our son disappeared. That emptiness trailed us like a ghost into every room, turning every family glance into a cold blade. Grace hurried over, her eyes glittering with a sweetness as fake as sugar. She hugged me, but the first words out of her mouth were, "You look so worn out. If only you knew how to enjoy life a little, maybe things would have been different." I bit my lip, swallowing the lump rising in my throat. Behind Grace, my mother frowned slightly, as if her youngest daughter's words were perfectly reasonable. My father poured himself a drink, silent. No one in the family mentioned the missing child. No one asked how we had survived these 5 months. The room was filled with laughter, but none of it was meant for us. The Christmas tree still stood there, glittering. But in my eyes, it was covered in the dust of lies. Gift boxes were stacked neatly beneath it, each ribbon tied with care. Looking at them, I felt my chest tighten. Once, my son had run circles around that tree, his tiny hands reaching curiously for the glass ornaments, his laughter the most beautiful sound of Christmas. Now, that void remained unfilled, yet the family acted as if he had never existed. Daniel whispered in my ear, "Breathe. Tonight will pass." But inside me, another voice said, "Tonight, no one truly welcomed us." The party carried on, Grace clinging to our mother, laughing brightly. My father boasted about work, praising Grace's success in some small project. Every word only deepened my sense of isolation. As if I were an uninvited guest, dragged into a Christmas play where every role was already cast. My role was silence. Daniel's was the shadow. And the radiant golden girl role, of course, belonged to Grace. I stared into the glass of wine in my hand, the tree's lights painting the liquid red. The bitter taste stuck in my throat, just like the resentment I kept swallowing. Outside the window, snow kept falling, pure white. But in this house, every layer of snow only covered the cracks in the family's facade. I turned slightly to Daniel. He met my gaze with worry, but also helplessness. He had stood by me through every police interrogation, every sleepless night waiting for news of our son. Yet now, he was as lost as I was adrift in the middle of my own family. I set the glass down and stared at the Christmas tree. Among the carefully wrapped presents, one small box, covered in silver blue paper, sat tucked away in the back. I didn't know why, but in that instant, it seemed to be calling my name. As if inside it was something no one wanted me to discover. I drew a long breath. The suffocating air, the fake smiles, my parents' coldness, and Grace's sweet triumph, they all seemed to lead me to that very moment. The moment a single gift would tear apart the family's mask. And I knew this Christmas would be unlike any other. Grace's little daughter squealed as she ran toward the base of the Christmas tree, her tiny hand reaching into the pile of glittering presents. The crinkle of wrapping paper, the snap of ribbons bursting open filled the room. And then, right in front of everyone's eyes, the small box wrapped in silver blue paper, the very box I had let my gaze linger on a moment ago, was opened. A toy rolled out, hitting the wooden floor with a sharp clack. I froze. It was a plastic toy airplane, its blue paint chipped, its wings scratched from countless crashes. It was the same one. The very toy Ethan, my son, had clutched in his hand on the afternoon he disappeared. I heard Daniel gasp beside me, as if the air had been sucked straight out of his lungs. The wine glass in my hand trembled, the red liquid rippling dangerously close to spilling. Every sound in the room, laughter, music, the clink of silverware against glass, suddenly dropped away, leaving only the pounding of my heart in my ears. I stepped forward, my eyes locked on the toy sitting snugly in my niece's small hand. My throat was dry, but I still heard my own voice break free, shaky yet strained with control. This airplane was in Ethan's hand right before he disappeared. The room went silent. The child blinked up at me, wide-eyed, confused. Daniel raised his hand to his mouth, struggling to steady himself, while my parents exchanged a glance, their expressions tight with annoyance, as if I had just ruined a joyful moment. Grace stepped forward, snatching the airplane from her daughter's hand with a dismissive smile. A smile that tasted sweet but cut like poison. "You're mistaken. I bought this at a thrift shop. Kids like these things, don't they?" I stared at her, stunned. For a fleeting second, I almost wanted to believe her. But then Grace's eyes, something she couldn't mask fast enough, shifted, darting away from mine. Just one brief flicker of avoidance, but it sent my chest tightening, the blood in my veins turning cold. I stepped closer, my voice breaking. "No. I know every scratch on it. I glued the wing back myself, the night before." Daniel gripped my hand tightly, as if to pull me back, to hold me from the storm rising in me. But I couldn't stop. That airplane wasn't just a toy, it was evidence, the fragile thread tying this moment to the day Ethan vanished without a trace. No one in the family said a word. Not one. Only the golden glow of the lamps stretched across the room, and the Christmas carols continued to hum from the speakers, turning into a cruel refrain. Grace smirked, twirling the toy in her hand as though it were nothing but a piece of useless plastic. "You always imagine things. Maybe that's why." She let the sentence hang. But I knew. In that icy stare was the unspoken accusation I never wanted to hear. "Maybe that's why you lost that child." Daniel suddenly stepped in front of me, his voice low but firm. "That's enough, Grace." In that instant, I saw it clearly. Everyone else in the room turned away, avoiding eye contact. As if no one wanted to be caught in the gravity of the truth hanging heavily between us. But I couldn't turn away. Not after I had seen Grace's faltering eyes. I stared at the gift, trembling. Behind Grace, the Christmas tree still glowed brilliantly, but to me, each light only illuminated more starkly the dust of deceit coating this house. In that moment, I knew a door had just swung open. A truth buried deep within this family was waiting. And that tiny airplane, no matter how small, was the key. I tightened my grip on Daniel's hand and drew in a long breath. I could feel the masks in that room beginning to crack, even as everyone tried to pretend nothing was breaking. And I swore to myself, this Christmas, I will not let anyone bury Ethan one more time. The image of the little blue toy airplane still haunted my eyes, and from it, fragments of memory began to return like shards of broken glass. I suddenly recalled the day Ethan disappeared, that sweltering summer afternoon when everything seemed so ordinary. Grace had said she would take Ethan out to the backyard to play, giving me some time to tidy up the kitchen. I smiled then, grateful, thinking my sister cared for my son. That was the last time I saw my boy holding someone's hand. And that someone was Grace. The small details I ignored back then now came flooding back. Grace often seemed irritated whenever Ethan clung to me, her eyes flashing with something I had once mistaken for weariness, but now I realized it was jealousy. Once, when I was holding Ethan while talking to our mother, Grace let out words sharp as a knife, "You don't even know how to appreciate him." I gave a strained laugh, brushing it off as just a passing reproach. But now, replaying each word, my heart ached as if stabbed. Our neighbor, the elderly woman who lived 2 houses down, once vaguely mentioned that afternoon she had seen Grace leading Ethan by the hand out through the gate. I dismissed it immediately, telling myself she must have been mistaken. How could I believe my own sister would take my son somewhere and never bring him back? Yet now, every word she had said echoed in my mind like a warning bell I had deliberately silenced. That once faded memory grew sharper, like a curtain being pulled open. I remembered Ethan's laughter ringing through the garden, while Grace simply stood watching, rarely joining in his joy. I remembered the moments when I hugged my son too tightly, and Grace looked at me with eyes full of something complicated, half pity, half reproach. They were all signs, but I had been blind enough to ignore them. I clenched my fists, my breath unsteady. Daniel placed a hand on my shoulder, but nothing could hide the wave of shock rippling through my body. Old fragments of memory details that once seemed harmless were now connecting into a chain that could no longer be denied. I had to face the truth. Grace was always uneasy seeing Ethan and me so close, and perhaps inside her, that bitterness had twisted into something darker. I whispered, my voice stretched thin with pain. Maybe I was blind because I believed family would never harm one another. In the room filled with Christmas lights, I realized that all the warmth I once believed in was nothing but a fragile shell. And that shell was cracking apart, piece by piece. The faint memories, the cutting remarks, the fleeting glances, all of it was surfacing, demanding that I look straight at them. I drew in a deep breath, my eyes never leaving Grace. This Christmas, perhaps I would have to face the cruelest truth, the truth I had been avoiding all along. And in my heart, a small flame began to stir. I would not let those signs slip past me ever again. Not waiting another second, I decided to call the police, despite the protests and furious stares from my family. I would not stay silent any longer. I called the police that very night. When the doorbell rang, the entire house seemed to hold its breath. Outside on the porch, the flashing red and blue lights reflected off the glass ornament hanging from the Christmas tree, making it gleam with a cold, eerie glow so different from the warm sparkle it had just minutes ago. I stood frozen, my heart pounding wildly, while Daniel gripped my hand as if afraid I might collapse. 2 officers walked in, carrying with them an air of solemn gravity. The once noisy living room instantly turned into an interrogation chamber. The crisp sound of pages flipping in their notebooks mixed with the sharp scratch of pens across paper. Each question they asked, and every probing stare they cast, tore through the mask of a perfect family my parents had always fought to preserve. Grace sat cross-legged, arms folded tightly across her chest, her voice unsettlingly calm. She answered each question briefly, clearly, almost without a trace of worry. And yet, it was exactly that composure that made my skin crawl. The child within me screamed that no one could be that calm when questioned about their own nephew's disappearance. My father's face turned crimson, veins straining as he bristled the moment the officers mentioned the possibility of involvement from within the household. He slammed his hand against the table, his voice cutting like a blade, "You're slandering the honor of my family. We don't need the police meddling in our affairs." My mother tugged at his sleeve, trying to calm him down, but even she couldn't hide the fury in her eyes. And that fury was directed at me, not at Grace, not at the suspicion itself. To them, the real betrayal was mine, for daring to fracture the fragile wall of family honor by speaking out. Daniel tightened his hold on my shoulder, giving me a subtle nod to stay strong. I looked around and saw everyone's gaze shifting restlessly between anger, doubt, and cold indifference. And I knew, in that moment, this room would never again be the place of Christmas memories. It had become a battlefield where truth and lies were locked in a brutal war. One officer glanced down at his notebook, lines of ink filling the page, then lifted his eyes to mine. "If you believe something is wrong, tell us everything. We need every detail." I inhaled deeply, my voice trembling but resolute. "That airplane, it's not a new toy. It was Ethan's. My son was playing with it right before he vanished. And the last person with him was Grace." The room grew thick with silence. Grace let out a soft laugh, but her lips quivered. She shrugged, dismissive. "You're imagining things. I bought it at a thrift store. Such a simple matter, and you've blown it out of proportion." The lightness in her tone choked me more than anger ever could. I stared at Grace, my eyes blurred with tears, but my voice suddenly sharpened like steel. "If there's nothing wrong, then what's there to fear from the light shining in?" The words dropped heavy into the silence, echoing against the four walls. One officer froze mid-sentence, staring at Grace for a long, unblinking moment. My parents averted their eyes, trapped on a tightrope between denial and reluctant recognition. Daniel squeezed my hand harder, a silent reminder that we had crossed a line there was no coming back from. This time, the truth would have to be faced even if it tore everything apart. Outside, the red and blue lights kept flashing against the glass ornament, spinning slowly like a relentless reminder. It was time for the dust of deceit that had settled over this family to be wiped clean. And I knew, from that moment on, the investigation had truly begun. And deep inside me, a chilling premonition crept in. The truth would not only expose Grace, but might very well drag this entire family into the abyss. The moment the police left, the house sank into a heavy silence. But that silence didn't last long. My father shoved his chair back hard, the scrape of wood against the floor sounding like a slash through the air. He turned toward me, his eyes bloodshot with rage. "All of this is your fault. You didn't watch the boy carefully, and now you dare to accuse your sister." I stood frozen. Those words fell like shards of glass, cutting deep into my skin. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. But then my mother rushed forward, her voice sharp and shrill. "That's right. You just want to blame Grace to cover up your own mistake. You're the mother who couldn't even keep your son safe, and now you want to drag this whole family into the abyss?" Daniel gripped my hand tightly, but even his strength wasn't enough to hold back the tears already spilling down my face. I choked up, wanting to speak, wanting to scream that they were blind. But the faces staring back at me, my father, my mother, and Grace with that half-pitying, half-triumphant look closed in on me like walls I couldn't break through. I turned to the dining table. Ethan's chair was still there, empty. The tablecloth brushed lightly against the backrest each time the wind slipped through the window, like an invisible hand reminding me of the absence that could never be filled. And I knew, in this room, it was that emptiness that stood as the truest witness, the witness to my pain. My father pressed on, his voice trembling not with grief but with pride wounded. "You've disgraced this family. You've turned our home into a joke for the whole neighborhood. What do you think people will say when the police come knocking in the middle of the night because of you?" His words slammed into my chest, each heartbeat threatening to break apart. Grace let out a faint smile, pretending to mediate. "Come on, Mom, Dad, she's just panicking too much, that's why she's imagining things." But that sweetened tone, that mask of innocence, was the blade twisting right into my heart. Because every glance from my parents, instead of questioning her, turned back on me as if I were the one guilty of everything. I trembled, struggling to find my voice. "I'm not making this up. I just want to find Ethan. Why can't you see that, Grace?" "Enough!" My mother shouted, her hand shaking only to conceal the steel in her voice. "From now on, keep your mouth shut. If you dare to speak another word of slander, then don't you dare call this place home." That sentence crashed down on me heavier than any accusation from the police. I looked at Daniel, saw his eyes rimmed red, but he stayed silent, knowing that any protest now would only wound me more. In my mind, one sentence echoed, part confession, part blade cutting through me. My family chose to believe a lie over my real pain. I sank down, wrapping my arms around my chest as if trying to keep my heart from shattering. Around me, the heavy breaths of my father, my mother's irritated whispers, the creak of Grace's chair as she adjusted her posture, all blended into a chaotic symphony. But within that noise, all I could hear was the hollow echo rising from Ethan's empty chair. That night, the house was no longer a refuge. It had turned into a warped courtroom, where justice was twisted by favoritism. And I, the one who had lost the most, became the accused. When I lifted my gaze, it landed on the glass ornament hanging from the Christmas tree, where dim light shimmered through. I told myself, if they had chosen to turn their backs, then I would have to walk the path of truth alone. And I knew that path would cut me with deeper wounds, but it was the only way to find Ethan. And in that very moment, I felt it clearly. This favoritism wasn't just a crack in the family, it was an abyss, one I had to choose either to be buried in, or to rise from. The next morning, loud knocks on the door echoed through the house, waking everyone still heavy from the arguments of the night before. It was the police. They had returned, this time not just to ask questions, but carrying a thick file. With a look that was both stern and cautious, the officer said, "We've found some irregularities connected to Grace." The air in the room froze. My parents' faces shifted in an instant, while Grace stiffened, her hand clutching the hem of her shirt. I couldn't breathe, my heart pounding as if it might burst, waiting for every word that followed. In the past 2 weeks, the officer flipped open the file. There have been transfers made from her account. Not large, but regular, and withdrawn in a residential area about a 30-minute drive from here. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, before placing several grainy photos on the table, printed from a surveillance camera in an old garage. In them, it was unmistakably Grace furtively installing a used camera. The room exploded in silence. My parents went pale, but said nothing. Grace forced a shaky smile. That's just a misunderstanding. I only bought second-hand equipment, but her voice trembled, stripped of any sweetness it once carried. I sat there, on the verge of tears, yet feeling myself slowly vindicated. For the first time, the truth glimmered through the smallest cracks. And in that same moment, I knew a new search had begun. That afternoon, I went with the police to the suburban apartment complex where the money transactions had been traced. The narrow road stretched ahead, flanked by old buildings draped in the gray of dust and time. As we climbed the creaky wooden stairs, I saw a green door, its paint peeling at the edges, with a weathered wind chime hanging above. Each gust of wind sent the metal pieces clinking, sharp and shrill, like a warning. The officer knocked. Silence. Then came the click of the lock. The door creaked open, and before me stood a woman I didn't know, gaunt face, eyes burning bright, hair hastily tied back. She flinched slightly at the sight of us, then quickly masked it with a strained smile. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. Before she could answer, a small figure appeared behind her, toddling across the room. I froze. It was Ethan. My son. He was wearing the familiar gray sweater, and around his neck was the blue scarf I used to wrap for him, frayed now, but undeniably his. My knees nearly gave out. Tears blurred my vision. Ethan saw me, his eyes widened, and in that instant, I read everything: confusion, surprise, and a joy that hadn't yet found words. He didn't have time to run toward me before the woman pulled him behind her, her voice breaking. This is my son. You've made a mistake. The officer stepped forward, his tone firm. "You are Margaret L., aren't you? The woman stripped of custody rights 7 years ago?" She trembled, retreating, her eyes drowning in despair. The room spun around me. Margaret, this woman was Ethan's biological mother. She had never disappeared from his life, only been forced away by the court. And now, she had returned, secretly, quietly, reclaiming him from my arms. I looked around the small apartment. On the living room wall were dozens of pictures of Ethan smiling, sleeping, playing. My breath caught when I realized some were recent, clearly taken during times he'd been taken out without my knowledge. In the dim yellow light, Ethan's face stared back at me from every photo, a painful reminder he was still a child, and deep down, still longed for the presence of his real mother. I stepped forward, my voice choked. "Ethan, my baby." He hesitated, his gaze shifting between me and the woman. But then, as the wind drifted through the window, the blue scarf around his neck fluttered, and I heard my own heartbeat thundering. This bond had never been severed. The officers entered, proceeding to separate Ethan from the woman. I rushed forward, wrapping him in my arms, his warmth flooding into me as though I had wandered in darkness for 1,000 years and finally found light. Ethan trembled in my embrace, then clutched at my shirt with all his might, as if afraid I might vanish. In that moment, I whispered, like a vow, like a truth, Ethan never left me. He was only hidden away. The pain in me did not fade. Because the truth revealed also meant new scars: the betrayal of Grace, the silence of my parents, and the looming shadow of the biological mother stripped of her rights yet now returned. But as I held Ethan, I knew one thing with certainty: I would never let anyone take him from me again. The scarf around his neck, once just a small item, now stood as a symbol of our bond, of the journey I had no choice but to continue, no matter the lies and darkness closing in. And as we left that apartment, under the dim streetlights, I told myself, this was only the beginning. The truth had flickered into view, but to protect Ethan, I would still have to face many deeper layers of secrets, including the cruelest truth waiting ahead. That morning, snow covered the porch. I heard the blaring siren of a police car tear through the air, and just seconds later, Grace was let out, her hands cuffed, her face pale. I looked at my sister writhing like a stranger, my heart both aching and surging with fury. In the interrogation room, the harsh light blazed down. I sat across from Grace, with nothing but a cold steel table between us. The officers leaned back, giving us a chance to talk. Grace tried to hold her composure, but her reddened eyes betrayed her. I pressed my voice low, each word hissing through my teeth. "Grace, why you? Why Ethan?" She gave a crooked, trembling laugh. "You'll never understand. Ever since we were kids, it was always you. Every compliment, every glance from Mom and Dad, they were always for you. I was just the shadow." I leaned forward, slamming my hand on the icy steel table. "A shadow? Do you even know what you've done? You tore this family apart. You took my son." Grace broke down, sobbing, her cries choking in her throat, but she still screamed. "You don't deserve him. Ethan clings to you, but do you know how to keep him safe? You let him slip right through your fingers. I just wanted you to feel what it's like to lose." "Lose?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the narrow room. "You used a child to get back at me? He's a human being, not some tool for your hatred." Grace trembled, her cuffed hands clenched so tightly they drew blood. She lowered her head, then spat out her confession like a blade. "I gave him to her, to his real mother. She promised me money. It was both to teach you a lesson and to benefit myself. I never thought it would go this far." The air grew heavy. I was frozen, and behind me Daniel groaned in despair. "Oh my God, it was you." Grace lifted her head, her eyes glistening with both hatred and despair. She screamed her final words, like a curse. "You don't deserve him. You never have, and you never will." The words crashed into my chest like a hammer. I choked, unable to speak. My whole body shook, hot tears spilling down my face. I looked at my sister, not the Grace I once knew, but a stranger consumed by jealousy and resentment. The officers stepped in, dragging Grace out. She still twisted back to look at me, her eyes burning with bitterness, a single tear falling onto the snow outside, cold, barren, and a stain of betrayal that would never be erased. Ethan wrapped his arms around me as I stepped out, too young to understand, whispering, "Mom, is Aunt Grace mad at me?" I choked back tears, holding him close, whispering, "No, sweetheart. You did nothing wrong. It's just, some people let hate turn them into someone else." Daniel gripped my hand tightly. His voice shook but was firm. "We still have each other. As long as we have that, we'll get through this." The snow kept falling, covering every trace. But inside me, the fracture would never fully heal. The day the court announced the verdict, the sky was overcast as if it, too, was weighed down. I sat in the courtroom, my hand gripping Ethan's tightly, while Daniel sat beside me like my only anchor. Standing before the judge, Grace was no longer the proud, defiant figure she once was. Her eyes looked tired, hollow. The judge read the sentence, each word echoing in the air, 15 years in prison. On the other side, the woman who had once been Ethan's biological mother was also convicted, charged with child abduction and complicity. No applause, no sighs of relief, only emptiness and the lingering shock of a tragedy that had just been laid bare. I turned to look at my parents. They sat there, faces soaked in tears. But not for me. Not for Ethan. They wept for Grace. My mother clutched her chest, crying out as the verdict was read, as if the one being convicted wasn't the person who had stolen my son, but some innocent child the world had treated cruelly. I bit my lip until it bled, my heart shattering all over again. No matter how many truths, how much evidence, in their eyes, Grace was always the one to pity and protect. And Ethan and I were nothing but shadows beneath that misguided favoritism. Ethan tilted his head up at me, his innocent eyes asking softly, "Mom, why is Grandma crying?" Aunt Grace did something wrong, my throat tightened. I didn't know how to answer. How could I explain to my son that sometimes love can become so twisted it stops being justice and turns into blindness? I pulled him close, whispering, "It's okay, sweetheart. We have each other, and that's all that matters." That afternoon, back home, I stared at the family photo on the wall. In it, Grace, my parents, and I sat side by side, all smiles as if nothing could ever tear us apart. My hands trembled as I lifted the frame. A sharp rip split the silence, the picture torn in two, the tear running right between my face and Grace's. One half slipped from my grasp and fell to the floor, the sound of paper hitting the ground like the final punctuation mark. I folded what remained and tucked it into a drawer, letting it stand as the last witness to a family already broken. That evening, my parents called. My mother's voice was choked with sobs. "Don't blame Grace. She made mistakes, but she's still your sister. No matter what, she's still blood." I sat silently, my hand tightening around the phone. At last, I replied, my voice cold as ice, "Mom, and what of blood? When blood betrays you, the wound cuts deeper than any knife. I can forgive fate, but I will never forgive the betrayal of my own blood." After that call, I blocked their number. Never again would I allow their favoritism, their blindness, to wound Ethan and me. My family had chosen to stand with the traitor. And I chose to protect my son and my own heart. In the days that followed, we moved away. A small apartment, not far from Ethan's school, with sunlight flooding in each morning and a balcony just big enough for a few pots of flowers. Daniel helped me arrange the furniture, while Ethan busied himself pinning his drawings to the wall. In that new space, for the first time in months, I felt a pocket of peace. I didn't need my parents' approval. I didn't need to cling to a family already shattered. As long as we had each other, it was enough to begin again. That first night in our new home, I stood watching my son sleep, his breathing steady, his messy hair spilling across the pillow. I reached down, touched his small hand, and whispered, "Sweetheart, I promise you, from now on, no one will ever take you away from me again." Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The city was quiet. In the soft glow of the lamp, I knew an old chapter had closed. And at the same time, a new one was beginning, a chapter of resilience, of unconditional love, and of the belief that even when betrayed by those who share your blood, you can still rewrite the meaning of family in your own way. That evening, in the small apartment we had just rented, Daniel was putting up curtains while I sat with Ethan at the study desk. He carefully placed the toy airplane on the shelf, whispering, "This is the guiding light." I laughed through tears. Yes, he was rewriting the meaning of the past, turning pain into a signal of safety. I knew it clearly. I had lost a family that should have protected me, but instead pushed me off a cliff. But I also found my real family, my son, and a husband who dared to stand by me. Family isn't about blood, it's where your heart is protected, where boundaries are respected. The next morning, on the way to his new school, Ethan held my hand so tightly that his small fingers trembled. I bent down and whispered, "If you get scared, remember the airplane on the shelf, it will show you the way home." He took a deep breath and nodded. When the school gate opened, a boy held out a ball, inviting Ethan to play. My son looked back at me, hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. His first laugh broke out, not long, but enough to let me know we were heading in the right direction. That night, Ethan drew a picture of a house with 3 people standing at the door and an airplane circling above. "This is our home," he explained. I hugged him and whispered, "Yes, and this house will never leave you standing outside the door again." I had chosen to put an end to the toxic bonds of blood. And from that decision, I felt stronger, strong enough to rewrite the future. Because true maturity is not always unconditional forgiveness, but the courage to draw boundaries to protect the ones you love. My dear friend, if you're listening to this story, perhaps you too have been left behind, longing for a guiding light in the dark. I want you to remember, you don't have to accept a family that exists only in name. A real family is where you are safe, where you are seen, and where you are truly loved. If you agree, leave a comment. Hit like, share this with someone who needs a reminder that they deserve a safe home, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue walking together on these journeys of healing. Thank you for staying until the very end.